All right, y'all. So in this lesson, we're going to be talking about defining the purpose of your podcast. So the first thing that you need to decide when you're starting a podcast is if this podcast is going to be for hobby or for profit. If this podcast is for hobby, then that means that it is something that you want to do to bring you joy and that it's not necessarily going to tie back to a paid offer, product, sponsorship, affiliate marketing, any of those things that can bring you income, which is totally fine. A lot of people like to do hobby podcasts because they just like to talk. They just like to share information about their lives, about things that they've been through, about a subject that they're passionate about. But if you are going to do a hobby podcast, then you know that you need to kind of tamper um, the amount of money that you're going to spend on the podcast, because if you're not going to be making that money back, then you really don't want to make a huge investment when it comes to things like equipment and hiring an editor and things like that. If you're going to do your podcast for profit, there's several different ways that you can bring profit into your podcast. So the most obvious way is if you already have a course or coaching, then you can automatically use your podcast to advertise for those things, to build your audience, to get people really engaged, and then those people will eventually turn into buyers. This also works if you have a pre-existing business where you want, customers, and they're going to be more likely to buy if they build a relationship with you. So that's the first and most easy way to make money. That's the most obvious. The other ways are things like getting ads or sponsors. So you can find a similar business that offers a product or a service that ties similarly into yours, and then you can get them to pay you to talk about their product or service on your podcast. You can also do what's called a paid podcast, where you use a platform where people need to pay to access your content. This works really well if you have a large audience already. So that's just a few ways that you can use your podcast to make money. We'll go more into that later in the later lessons, but the biggest thing that you need to decide right now is, am I doing this podcast for profit or am I doing it as a hobby? And based on that information is going to affect the call to action that you have at the end of your podcast. So if you are doing it as a hobby, then you may have a call to action that's, reach out to me on Facebook or join our free Facebook group, depending on how you have, this hobby set up and how far you're taking it. If you are doing it for profit, your main call to action is always going to be a moneymaker. So it's going to be hop on a discovery call or visit our website, or, if you want to like work them through your funnel, you can always say like, join our Facebook group, reach out to me and send me a message. Those are all things that are going to continue your relationship and build upon it so that people are going to be more likely to buy from you. The next thing you need to decide is if you are going to be using your podcast as a piece of macro content. Macro content is a large piece of content that you then break down into smaller pieces of content. So it would be taking your podcast and turning it into a blog post and Facebook and Instagram post and Pinterest pins, all of the things. So a piece of macro content is usually audio or video, or, obviously both. So you need to decide if you're going to use your podcast as a piece of macro content, and if you're going to just do audio, or if you also want to do video. Doing video can be really good if it's something that you're comfortable with, because you can also post on YouTube. And the people who listen to podcasts and the people who watch YouTube are usually a little bit different. So you're going to hit two different audiences with the same piece of content. And then you're going to be able to take that content and break it down into blog post, Instagram post, Facebook post. So you're going to be hitting all of the different markets possible with just one piece of content, which is my absolute favorite thing about podcasting. So the very last thing that you need to think about is, how will podcasting fit into your overall funnel? Again, this is if you're doing it for profit, or if you have some outcome that you want the listener to complete at the end. So when you are marketing in Facebook groups or talking to people through messages? Are you going to refer them to your podcast to try to build that relationship? Are you going to start by sending them to your website? You have to figure out when you're speaking to somebody how your podcast is going to fit into your funnel. At what point are you going to tell people, hey, go listen to my podcast? I think that when you're marketing in Facebook groups, it is really great to use your podcast as a marketing tool there, because a lot of Facebook groups have rules against self-promotion. So like posting a link to book a call or to your website. But most Facebook groups are okay with you sharing a link to a podcast episode, so long as it's relevant. So what I like to tell my clients to do, and we also do for some of our clients, is that we go through the Facebook group and we type into the search bar the topic of a recent episode. So say it's SEO. So then we type into the Facebook group SEO, hit most recent, and then it'll come up with a list of posts where people were asking about SEO. And then we just plug that link in and say, hey, we just released a podcast episode on this exact topic. We think you'd find it really helpful. Go take a listen. And then not only is that person who posted the question going to see it, but so is everybody else that ever clicks on that post, and anybody else who comments is also going to see it. So you're really reaching a wide audience. So before you start your podcast, before we move on to anything else, you need to decide if this podcast is a hobby or if you are doing it for profit. Then you also need to decide what your call to action is going to be. What do you want people to do after they listen to your podcast? You need to decide if you're going to be using your podcast as a piece of macro content, and what pieces of micro content are you going to turn your podcast into? And you need to decide how your podcast fits into your overall existing funnel. Once you do these things, it will start to become really clear on how you're going to move forward and what pieces you need to have in place. And it will be overwhelming, but I promise you through this course, we're going to go through everything that you need to know to get you from A to B and put all of these pieces together to create an amazing podcast.